And in Russia, high-level sources within the Kremlin report that Russian President Vladimir Putin has learned of an assassination plot against former Prime Minister Vladimir Putin, masterminded by former KGB director Vladimir Putin. Putin was reportedly heard raving that he knew Putin's fingerprints were all over the plan to kill Putin and signed an executive order authorizing Putin to assassinate Putin before Putin could give Putin the go-ahead to have Putin assassinate Putin.
Today on Categorical Imperatives, we are talking about the Russia and Ukraine war. Because, while that opening clip from The Onion may be satire, it is satire that doesn't sound nearly as far-fetched as it would have a few weeks ago. Because it seems the entire country has lost their collective goddamn minds and made Vladimir Putin the source of everything bad in the world, because he is an evil, bad man who is both evil and bad. Now, while the guy is a dick, and he is certainly responsible for the war taking place right now, there is much more nuance and complexity to the important issues surrounding this war. In a sense, as you guys know, I'm really more of a law-talking guy.
I move for a bad court thingy.
You mean a mistrial?
Yeah. That's why you're the judge and I'm the law-talking guy.
The lawyer.
Right.
I thought I would bring on a foreign policy talking guy. So I have Dave DeCamp I brought back on the show again to discuss these issues surrounding the war and to get a complete picture of what is going on. Now, Dave is the news editor over at antiwar.com, and he and everyone over there have been doing a great job covering this conflict. And I mean that in a very broad sense, because this isn't a discussion that is a couple weeks or even months old. This is years of history that need to be understood to really understand what is going on. And antiwar.com, more than any other source in my opinion, is the best place to find that kind of deep, really thorough coverage. So I will put a link to their site down in the video description, as well as just a few of my favorite articles from Dave that I found especially helpful and interesting in understanding the ongoing and unfolding situation. So stay tuned for a great discussion that we had right after this. Hey everybody, welcome back to Categorical Imperatives. Today I am joined by Dave DeCamp. He is the news editor for antiwar.com. I apologize, we're having some technical difficulties, which is why I'm doing this Skype call right now. But anyways, Dave, thank you so much for joining me here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me back.
Yeah, so you're here. I want to talk about what is going on in Russia. And so I guess the first thing is, can you give us some idea of just what it looks like on the ground?
Yeah, well, so it looks like, their kind of assault, their invasion on Ukraine is focused on a few kind of key areas. In the southeast there, in the Donbass region, the Donetsk Oblast, there's the city of Mariupol, where there's a lot of heavy fighting. That's on the Sea of Azov. And, it's important for people to understand that before Putin, launched this attack, there was a war going on in eastern Ukraine for the past 8 years, since 2014, when the U.S. backed the ousting of Viktor Yanukovych, who was seen as he was the more Russia-friendly president. And that coup sparked the separatists in the Donbass, in the Donetsk and Luhansk republics, is what they call themselves, to declare independence from Kiev. And that sparked a war in the Donbass there. And it was a pretty brutal war for a few years. A ceasefire was agreed to under the Minsk Accords, but they were never fully implemented. So there was always ceasefire violations. The war was a stalemate pretty much for the past 6 years, but there was always ceasefire violations and shelling on either side. A lot of civilians were killed by Ukrainian forces. So that's kind of the background that people have to understand.
All right.
So when Putin ordered his invasion, he framed it as first he recognized Donetsk and Luhansk, those two breakaway republics, and so a big part of the fighting is focused on taking the whole Donbass region there that the separatists claim from the Ukrainian forces that are there, and Putin has said he's denazifying Ukraine. That's part of his operation. Now he does exaggerate, I think, how many Nazis there are in Ukraine and Ukraine's government, but there is a real, these days everybody gets called a Nazi now by Western media, but there's real neo-Nazi elements in Ukraine. The most well-known, the most infamous, is the Azov Battalion, and they're in the city of Mariupol. They're part of the Ukrainian National Guard now. So the Russian assault there is kind of more heavy than in the other areas. And then they're also launching strikes on Kiev still. Northeast city of Kharkiv has seen a lot of shelling, and just cities along the Black Sea on the Dnieper River there. But it's mostly focused in eastern Ukraine, and that's where we're at now. We haven't seen the full force of the Russian Air Force yet, as they're still trying to get some terms out of Ukraine for a surrender.
And the separatists, I mean, there was an actual request on their part for help from Russia, right? I mean, so this wasn't just entirely Putin acting on his own.
Well, yeah, I mean, the separatists in 2014, they asked to join Russia back then when Putin took Crimea. So for a long time, they've been asking Russia for recognition and for help. And I have to say, I think the last time we talked, I was really, downplaying the chances of Russia invading Ukraine. I thought a lot of it was hype. I thought it was the U.S. intelligence agencies lying again. But, there was always a possibility of this war flaring up in eastern Ukraine. But what Putin has ordered is clearly more than just taking the Donbass. But right now, it still doesn't look like to me that he's not trying to take over Ukraine. He wants Crimea and Donbass, Crimea to be officially recognized as part of Russia by Ukraine, and he wants the Donbass to be, independent. They would be de facto part of Russia, even if he doesn't formally absorb them into the Russian Federation. And then those are the terms that Russia has laid out to Ukraine. They've said that the fighting would stop if Ukraine declared its neutrality, which meaning it wouldn't be aligned with NATO and it wouldn't try to join the EU. And if they recognize Crimea as Russian and recognize the independence of the Donbass. Now, he's also saying they have to demilitarize, denazify. So it depends on how far those, terms are. But for now, it does seem like the war could be stopped if the U.S. And it's because right now the U.S. and its NATO allies, they're just flooding Ukraine with weapons. They're sending them Stinger anti-aircraft missiles, the Javelin anti-tank missiles. They're thinking about sending them fighter jets. So there's not really any push that I've seen from the Biden administration to push Zelensky and Ukraine to declare neutrality, to say, hey, we're not coming to fight Russia for you. So you would be better off trying to work something out, find a deal here. It seems like the U.S. is kind of stoking it, and that they want to fund like an insurgency against Russia and bog Putin down in this war.
Yeah, well, and we've even been seeing quite a bit of saber rattling coming from the left and the right, really, of people who really seem to be very insistent that we owe it to Ukraine to actually get in there and invest our own troops. So, I mean, do you think that that's something that's realistic, or does the fact that Biden's seems genuinely opposed to that, is that a good sign at least?
Yeah, I mean, he said, him and Stoltenberg, he's the head of NATO, they've both said that they're not sending troops into Ukraine to fight Russia. But, it's pretty scary. There's a lot of momentum now for this idea of imposing a no-fly zone over Ukraine. That's something Zelensky is basically begging for the U.S. and NATO to do. And what people don't understand is that a no-fly zone means that the U.S. would have to enforce it by shooting down Russian planes and by bombing Russian air defenses in Russia and probably Belarus too, it would mean a direct war with Russia, which would mean World War III really, and it could very quickly turn into nuclear war. So far, it's just really kind of the most extreme hawks in Congress. Only person I've seen really call for it is Adam Kinzinger, a Republican, but even Marco Rubio, who's a serious hawk, he's saying we can't do this. We can't do the no-fly zone. I mean, I saw there was protests in, I think it was Chicago. I think there's a lot of Ukrainian Americans there, something calling for the U.S. to close the sky over Ukraine. But that people need to understand that means direct war with Russia, and that just can't happen. And this is part of the whole thing, is that the U.S. Biden is they were never going to help Ukraine fight against Russia, but they kind of led Ukraine down this path of accepting all this help from NATO and becoming kind of a de facto NATO member without the collective defense treaty. So it's really just the U.S. that support for Ukraine is very much responsible for Putin making his decision to invade. Of course, it's all, he's the one that did it and he's the one that's dropping the bombs, but you have to understand the events leading up to this. I don't think it needed to happen, and it could have been avoided, I believe, by the U.S. if they actually tried some diplomacy.
Right. And the other thing that I've heard is that the Ukraine has applied to the EU for membership. Is that a possible alternative at this point? Is that something that you could see happening?
Yeah, Zelensky, he formally applied the other day. I don't see that happening anytime soon, at least. Even the process, if you go on the EU website and you look at their process for a state to join, it's it would take a few years as it is, and and it would need the approval of all 27. I think there's 27 EU countries. Of all the EU countries would need to approve it, and there's already I've seen some say that they're against the idea, so I don't see that happening.
All right. And there were so two different things I wanted to ask you about here, as far as the U.S. coming into this, and that I've been seeing people talk about. Let me see. It's the Bucharest Memorandum and Article 5, and people. It seems like a lot of people are saying that these are agreements that could really trigger us into to give us no choice but to have to go in and support NATO. But the way I read, especially the Bucharest Memorandum, the way I read the agreement, it doesn't seem like that's the case. Can you kind of clear that up?
Yeah, the Bucharest Memorandum, I don't see. I've seen people say that too, but I don't see how any way that implies that the U.S. is supposed to come defend Ukraine because they gave up their Soviet-era nuclear weapons. I don't really understand how people make that leap. And then with Article 5, that's the NATO. That's part of the NATO treaty that triggers the collective defense of the alliance, and that would only be triggered if the fighting spilled into a NATO country, which there's a lot of NATO countries that border Ukraine and Russia now, Poland, and then you have all the Baltic states, and even just in the area there, Romania. But as it stands now, Ukraine's not a NATO member, so it doesn't trigger Article 5, this war. And like I said, I mean, there's no way they're going to join NATO now as they're fighting against Russia.
Yeah. I guess another thing I wanted to ask you about is we've been hearing about Putin putting nuclear forces on alert, and that really sounds bad. But what I'm wondering is that something that's maybe being over-reported? Is that maybe something that's a little more common than we think, and they're just putting a bad spin on it? Or how serious is that?
Well, practically speaking, Russia and the U.S.'s nuclear forces are, pretty much always ready to go at a moment's notice.
Yeah.
So Putin's order was, for public consumption, I think. And but I don't think there was anything. I don't think it's been reported wrongly. I mean, he did that because he wanted to send a message, and I think we have to take that message seriously. As you can see, for the past few months leading up to the invasion, the U.S. wasn't taking what Putin was saying seriously, and I was wrong. During the negotiations before the invasion, Putin was demanding that the U.S. guarantee that Ukraine won't ever join NATO, and the U.S. kind of refused to, even though Biden himself said that they're not joining NATO anytime soon. But they made counter offers for what I thought was some pretty serious offers for arms control. So I thought maybe that would be enough to work something out. But it turned out I was wrong. And what's kind of shocking to me is that if the U.S. intelligence was right that Russia was planning this invasion, how could they not try to stop it by just saying Ukraine's never going to join NATO? Like, it's just such a inconsequential thing. So that's why I do think that a lot of people in the Biden administration wanted this to happen, and now you see the sanctions are really trying to isolate Russia, and we're kind of entering like a new phase with Russia that seems to be even worse than during the Cold War. I mean, I wasn't alive during the Cold War. I was born in 1990, but from how I understand it, just from reading about it and talking to people that were alive then, is that it was always kind of the idea of the Soviet Union and the U.S. going to war directly was just completely unthinkable because of all the nukes. Now, there is less nukes now, but they still both have about 6,000. Russia and the U.S. each have about, give or take a few hundred, they each have about 6,000 nuclear warheads. It's 90% of the nukes in the world. So, the attitude should still be that we can't go to war with Russia. It should be unthinkable. It shouldn't even be an option to do something like a no-fly zone or put troops in Ukraine.
Right. And along those lines too, as far as these sanctions go, and sanctions recently, it seems like they've become seen by a lot of people as like almost a first line of defense against countries that are acting up, as though it's really no big deal to put these in place. But I mean, isn't that traditionally something that is seen as an act of war, like a blockade?
Yeah. I mean, and that's what they do amount to when they really sanction a country, like countries like Iran and Venezuela. They're essentially under economic blockade by the U.S., and that's what the steps that they're trying to take with Russia now. And the U.S. is really quick to use sanctions, and it's gonna backfire as we're seeing now. Russia. These sanctions are gonna hurt Russia kind of initially, but they've been preparing for this, I think. And you have China now and Russia are growing closer together because they're kind of facing similar pressure. I mean, we still have a major trade relationship with China, and it would take years and years to really change that. But we have been hitting China with sanctions, and we're kind of militarizing areas near China. So, kind of facing that same pressure, it's natural for them to grow, for their trade relationship to grow. And Russia has been cutting big oil deals with China. And now just today, Biden banned the import of Russian oil. And, if you look at gas prices around the country,
That's just such a mistake.
Yeah, it's not just going to hurt Russia. It's going to really hurt Americans. I think we only import like about 3% of our oil and gas from Russia. I might have that number wrong, but we're still going to really feel it. And the sanctions, people in Russia, they're the ones that are really going to suffer from the sanctions. It's not Putin, and it's not his inner circle. They'll be able to get by, no problem.
Yeah.
It's regular people, and it is collective punishment, and they know this. Biden at his State of the Union, he bragged about how the hit that Russia's economy was taking. So yeah, I mean, if you put the shoe on the other foot, if there was a country powerful enough to really hurt the United States, or even let's say China just stopped exporting stuff to the U.S., I mean, that would we would probably consider that an act of war, and that's what we're doing to Russia.
Yeah. And I think I heard something earlier today about China and Russia growing together economically. It sounds like China's kind of stepping in as far as the way Russia's been cut off to like the SWIFT international finance system. Have you heard anything about that?
Yeah, I don't know too much like the details about China's. I know they have an alternative to it, but and I know that one oil deal that they just made with Russia, they used the Chinese currency to make the deal as opposed to the U.S. dollar. So you see things like that, and this is what kind of trying to control the world, as the U.S. has done, is going to inevitably lead to. I think is the kind of collapse of the U.S.-led system when more and more countries move away from the dollar, and that can really hurt, the U.S. empire.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's really one of the few things we still have going for us is still being the nation's reserve or the world's reserve currency.
Mm-hmm.
So, well, I wanted to also talk about like misinformation and disinformation. And so I kind of asked you a question. I put it to you yesterday, but as far as people such as myself who don't necessarily have time to deal with foreign policy and foreign affairs as much as someone like you do, how can we, like, especially with watching the corporate media or consuming news in general, what can people do to kind of parse out truth from, what's false or fact from fiction?
Yeah, well, it's really hard, especially as a conflict is happening, as like the fighting that we see in Ukraine. It's really hard to know what's what, and I think that's the first thing people should just keep in mind, is that the initial reports that you're going to get from these cities in Ukraine, probably aren't going to be accurate. Right now, especially, Ukraine, they're trying to get the U.S. and NATO involved, so they have an interest in making things look worse than they are, and that's not to excuse what Russia's doing. They've said that they're only targeting, military targets, but that's at this point that's clearly not true. And even if they were, the nature of airstrikes, of bombing places, is civilians are going to be killed because you can't control what you hit, and we see that with the U.S. The drone war. So I think that's the first thing people need to understand, is kind of just be skeptical of everything. When you hear about casualties and even just incidents. I mean, there was the kind of the most infamous one that's come out of this now is this Snake Island story. It's a little island in the Black Sea. It's like one of the first days of when the fighting first really broke out. And Zelensky, the president of Ukraine, said 13 Ukrainian soldiers died defending Snake Island from Russia, and they had a video or a recording of them telling the Russian warship to go F themselves, and then they all died. Well, it turned out that wasn't true. They all were taken as hostages. They surrendered, and that's what Russia said happened that same day. So that should, make everybody cautious of the information we're getting, and we're going to find out. It's also, you don't need to know everything that's happening at once. Like, you have to, eventually we're going to really find out what has been happening in these early days of this war. And when it comes to kind of sorting through all this stuff, I mean, that's a big part of what we do at antiwar.com and in the news section. We're sorting through hundreds of articles each day right now, and we put up the ones that we think are worth something. And I write up some things, and for me, I've been mostly focusing on like the U.S. side of it, what the U.S. is doing, what NATO is doing, the increased support for Ukraine, and the negotiation side of it, because hopefully they work something out here so that this doesn't drag out for as long as it could. And a lot of things we post, like if you go on our website, you'll see in the lower section we have just linked articles from all over the web there, and a lot of things we post are from Reuters, like their newswire. They're just short articles that they don't editorialize, that just say a few sentences of what they're reporting. And you'll say Ukraine says this, say 21 civilians killed in this airstrike in Kharkiv, let's just say, and it's Ukrainian authorities saying it. Just you gotta see where the number's coming from. I think the UN, they've been keeping up a civilian count. They say over 400 civilians have been killed so far. Ukraine is saying it's like over 2,000. So I would be more inclined to believe the UN number, even though sometimes the UN isn't really the best source. But right now it's, I think, the best thing we have. And then, you see these huge conflicting casualties. Russia said the other day that about 500 of their troops have been killed, and I think Ukraine is saying that they've killed like 4,000 Russian troops. So you got to assume the truth is somewhere in the middle. Ukraine has an interest in portraying that they're doing better than they are in the battles, and Russia has an interest in kind of downplaying their casualties. But so yeah, I mean, that's just all stuff to keep in mind. And then whenever something happens in foreign policy, like if you don't really pay attention to it too much. I mean, you see with this Ukraine thing, all of the mainstream reporting and all of the people that weren't paying attention to the war in eastern Ukraine, that weren't paying attention to the negotiations between the U.S. and Russia that have been happening for a few years, that didn't realize that the U.S. was arming Ukraine to fight a war on Russia's border that's been going on for 8 years. And people that don't understand, the history of NATO expansion after the Cold War, and the collapsing arms control treaties. That's another big thing, is that during the Trump administration, the U.S. pulled out of a few arms control deals with Russia, and that has played into all of this. So it's always the historical context you're not going to find in the mainstream reporting, and you can look. It's always just good to try to look into the history of a conflict if you don't know much about it, and you see it in the news a lot, because they're always leaving something out, and they have an agenda to push.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, that was, I think, really good advice too, that you don't need to know everything right away necessarily. And I think a lot of people, and myself included, I really want to know everything that's going on right now, and I definitely think that's good advice to just kind of be patient sometimes and just sort of let the truth filter through.
Mm-hmm.
All right. And so I guess, is there anything else about what's going on that I haven't asked you about that we're talking about, or maybe an aspect of this that people in the corporate media aren't talking about, that something that people need to understand that isn't really being brought up at this point, that you'd like to kind of get across?
Well, yeah, and I've been kind of mentioning it since we've started talking, but really from the U.S. perspective here, is that like by flooding weapons into Ukraine, and it also appears that the Biden administration is kind of discouraging Ukraine from talking to Russia. Biden has no plans to talk with Putin, the White House said the other day. They're not trying to resolve this diplomatically, and I think that's really important to know, because you think if they really care about Ukrainians, they would be trying all avenues to resolve the conflict besides just giving Ukraine weapons. You'd at least be exploring diplomatic options, I would think, and I think that really says something. I don't think, a lot of people that have their mind made up about Putin aren't going to believe this, but I don't think he's trying to take over Ukraine. I don't think he's trying to bring back the Soviet Union, and I think he has clear goals that he's laid out, and I don't have a reason to think he would ever try to go beyond that. And that's not just me. Somebody who's been really good on this, and he's on the news a lot these days, is Colonel Douglas McGregor, who he's retired. He was actually appointed as a special advisor to Trump's Secretary of Defense in it was like the last 2 months of the Trump administration. He finally hired somebody good. But he was right, because a lot of us were wrong that I didn't think this would happen the way it did. But McGregor said he expected it to happen. He expected this invasion to happen, and he's also saying that Putin doesn't want to go west of the Dnieper River in Ukraine. You can look on a map; you see it goes through Kiev. And I think we should listen to him, because he was right about the invasion, and he seems pretty certain about what Putin's goals are. And it's also good to just listen to what Putin says. He gave a speech right after he recognized the Donbass, right before he ordered the operation. It was a long speech, maybe an hour long. And he, all the mainstream Western press just picked up on the fact that it was like kind of a history lesson, and he was talking about how the communists made Ukraine its own country, and the parts of eastern Ukraine aren't Russia because of the communists. And they took this as him trying to rewrite history and saying Ukraine doesn't have a right to exist as a country. But then if the other half of his speech was all about NATO expansion, it was all about the U.S. backing a coup in Ukraine and putting, a Western-friendly government in power there. So it's very clearly all about the U.S. and NATO's presence in the region and support for the Ukrainian government against Russia. So people just need to understand that. And if the U.S. has any power in this situation, it's not to go to war with Russia, because the U.S. can't go to war with Russia. It's to push Ukraine to accept a diplomatic settlement. And at this point, it's not going to be as good as it could have been before the war for Ukraine. But I really do think that Russia is willing to, not take over the country. And as long as it gets Crimea recognized and the Donbass recognized as independent, and NATO weapons aren't flooding into the country.
All right. Cool. Well, I think we're going to wrap it up there then. So everyone definitely make sure to check out antiwar.com. And they really are the best place to get news about this kind of stuff. Really, they do fantastic work. So go check Dave and everybody else. There's Scott Horton, Kyle Anzalone, Ray McGovern, a lot of really good people writing over there. So, all right. Anyway, Dave, thank you so much for giving me some of your time here today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. I appreciate it.
All right.
Motherfucker, like Freddie Mercury.